Have you ever wondered why the people who have been hurt the most often see life with a different kind of clarity, as if pain opened a part of them that had been asleep before? This is not about being chosen in a dramatic or mystical sense, but about how suffering removes the layers we once used to protect ourselves and reveals something more honest beneath. In this series, we explore how the cracks in us do not break us, but make space for awareness to enter. The way Alan Watts described the self unfolding when we stop resisting what life brings. If this feels familiar to you, you can stay. And if you'd like to walk through this gently, you can subscribe, and we'll move through this together. Chapter 1. The Crack in the Shell. There comes a time in life when the world does not unfold according to our expectations. And when that happens, something within us begins to shift in ways we did not anticipate. Most of us spend the early part of life constructing a kind of emotional shell, not intentionally, but naturally, through experiences, cultural expectations, small rewards, casual praises, and the desire to be understood and accepted. This shell is made of all the beliefs we hold about who we are and who we should be. We develop an image of ourselves that feels stable and reliable. We learn how to present ourselves in ways that seem to work. We come to trust this identity because it helps us move through life with some sense of orientation. It is our familiar center. But life is not a system designed to keep us comfortable, and sooner or later something arrives that the shell cannot hold. Sometimes it is a heartbreak. Sometimes it is rejection. Sometimes the loss is subtle, a gradual realization that who we have been pretending to be does not feel real anymore. Sometimes the breaking is loud and dramatic. Sometimes it happens slowly and quietly, almost unnoticed, until one day we realize that something inside us has already changed beyond repair. When this crack appears, our first instinct is to try to close it, to return to how things used to feel, to tighten the grip on the identity we once trusted. We might try to distract ourselves, to fix the external situation, to regain control in any way possible. Yet no matter how hard we try, there is an undeniable awareness that something has already opened, and that we are not the same as before. The discomfort that follows often feels disorienting, because the shell represented safety. When it cracks, we feel exposed, uncertain, and strangely unfamiliar even to ourselves. Alan Watts frequently discussed how the self we believe ourselves to be is not a solid object, but a fluid process, constantly changing in response to the conditions we move through. However, most of us are taught to view the self as something fixed and defined. We cling to roles, labels, stories, and identities because they provide a sense of grounding, even when they no longer reflect who we are. The crack in the shell forces us to confront the truth that we are not finished beings. We are in motion. We are ongoing. The breaking of the shell is often painful, not because something has gone wrong, but because we are being asked to experience ourselves more directly than before. Beneath the shell, there are emotions we have avoided, desires we have silenced, and vulnerabilities we have covered over in the hope that they might disappear if we ignored them long enough. When the shell breaks, all of this steps forward. It is not always dramatic. Sometimes it simply feels like a quiet heaviness that accompanies us everywhere. A sense of being more open than we are used to. A sense that our heart has become closer to the surface of our life. This openness is not weakness. It is sensitivity. And sensitivity is a form of intelligence that comes only when we stop hiding from ourselves. People who have gone through deep emotional cracks often become more attentive to subtle emotional shifts, both in themselves and others. They hear what is not said in conversations. They notice the pauses between words. They understand the quiet signals behind decisions. They develop a form of perceptive awareness that cannot be taught in language or theory. It is something learned through direct encounter with life. Alan Watts often compared human growth to the life of a seed. A seed begins as a hardened shell, closed and complete in appearance. But in order for it to become what it is meant to be, the shell must break. From the outside, this breaking might resemble destruction. Yet what is happening is not ruin, but transformation. The seed is not dying when it cracks. It is beginning to live in a new form. The same applies to us. The crack is not the end of who we are. It is the beginning of a larger, deeper, more connected version of ourselves emerging. However, this growth does not feel beautiful while it is happening. In the early stages, the crack often feels like loss of certainty, loss of identity, loss of the comfort that came from believing we understood our place in the world. We may feel fragile, as if the smallest moment could cause everything to collapse. We may feel as though we have to hold ourselves carefully, as if we might break again. Yet what is really happening is that we are being reintroduced to our own humanity. To be human is to be incomplete, constantly unfolding, continually shaped by life. When the shell breaks, we become aware of the tender, unfinished layers within us. And while this tenderness can feel overwhelming, it is also the place where connection is possible. We begin to see others more clearly. We recognize the quiet difficulties that are often hidden beneath ordinary expression. We become slower to judge because we understand that everyone is navigating something invisible. Compassion arises not as a moral decision, but as a natural response to having seen our own depth. This is why those who have experienced emotional breaking often develop a kind of softness that does not mean fragility, but rather an openness to life as it is. Not as we wish it to be, not as we were told it should be, but as it shows itself moment by moment. This softness is not passive. It is grounded. It is attentive. It is capable of deep empathy without losing awareness of its own boundaries. The crack in the shell does not resolve quickly. It becomes a slow and ongoing teacher. It teaches us that control is limited, that identity is fluid, that vulnerability is not a flaw, and that strength is not always loud. It teaches us that growth does not always look like improvement. Sometimes it looks like learning how to simply stay with what is real. And over time, the crack stops feeling like damage and begins to feel like space. Space through which light enters, feeling enters, understanding enters. The shell breaks so that we may meet ourselves. Chapter 2. Pain as an invitation. There are periods in life when something painful arrives unexpectedly, interrupting the sense of steadiness we believed we had built. It may be a disappointment that lingers in the background of daily life, or a heartbreak that feels sharp and immediate, or even a subtle shift in how we experience ourselves, something that cannot quite be explained but is undeniably present. Pain does not usually announce its arrival with clarity. Instead, it appears gradually or suddenly, depending on the circumstance, but always at a moment when we are still holding on to an older version of ourselves. It asks us to turn inward, even when the instinct is to move outward in search of distraction or escape. Many of us grow up with the idea that pain is something to conquer or avoid. a sign that we have failed in some way, or a temporary inconvenience to be overcome before returning to normal life. Because of this, when pain appears, the natural response is to resist it, to push it away, to try to restore whatever life looked like before the disruption occurred. Yet pain does not appear without reason. It has its own intelligence. It does not simply arise to harm us. It contains information about something that requires attention, something we may have ignored or suppressed, sometimes for a very long time. Alan Watts often explained that awareness does not grow in comfort. When everything is stable and familiar, we tend to navigate the world in a habitual way, acting from patterns that have been repeated so many times that we no longer question them. These patterns may be effective, but they are not always truthful. They allow us to function, but they do not always allow us to feel. Pain interrupts these patterns not in order to break us, but to wake us. It calls our attention to the parts of ourselves we have not been listening to. The invitation of pain begins in the simple act of noticing. Noticing that something feels unsettled. Noticing that the thoughts that once felt reliable now feel uncertain. Noticing that the emotions that once stayed beneath the surface are now rising toward awareness. This noticing is not dramatic. It is quiet, slow, and subtle. The body tightens in certain situations. The chest feels heavy during conversations where we once felt light. The mind revisits memories or questions that we hoped had already been resolved. Pain places a light on whatever has been hidden. If we respond to pain by immediately trying to escape, the message remains undelivered. We might distract ourselves with work, relationships, busyness, or habits that temporarily soften discomfort, but the underlying signal remains. The pain will return, not because it seeks to overwhelm us, but because what needs to be acknowledged has not yet been acknowledged. Avoidance delays growth. It does not prevent it. Pain becomes a teacher when we allow ourselves to stay with the feeling enough to understand what it is connected to. This does not mean we must analyze ourselves intensely or search for meaning through force. It means approaching pain with curiosity rather than rejection. We might ask ourselves gentle questions, such as, what is this experience asking me to see? What am I holding on to that no longer supports who I am becoming? Where am I overriding my own needs? In what ways have I been silent with myself? These questions do not have immediate answers, and they do not require immediate solutions. Pain is not asking for resolution. It is asking for presence. There is a difference between suffering and pain. Pain is the natural experience of encountering something difficult. Suffering emerges when we resist the experience, when we attempt to hold life still while it is moving. Alan Watts often described suffering as the friction created when we try to stay the same in a world that is constantly in motion. Life is always changing. Identities shift. Relationships evolve. Values transform. And yet, we often cling to the familiar, even when it limits us, because the familiar feels safe. Pain appears when it is time for us to grow beyond what is familiar. This growth is not the dramatic transformation that self-help language often suggests. It is not a leap or a breakthrough. It is a gradual widening of awareness. We become more honest with ourselves. We begin to recognize which parts of our life have been sustained by habit rather than sincerity. We notice the ways we have shaped ourselves to fit into expectations, roles, or narratives that were never truly chosen. Pain asks us to stop pretending that everything is fine when it is not. It brings us into direct contact with the truth of our experience. There is a kind of strength that grows out of this openness. Not the loud strength of confidence or control, but a quiet strength rooted in understanding. When someone has stayed present with their own pain, they begin to recognize the inner experiences of others as well. They become more attentive in conversation, more aware of emotional nuance, more willing to listen deeply. They understand that every person carries invisible experiences, and that the inner life of another person can never be fully known from the outside. This recognition softens the way we interact with others. Compassion begins not as a moral ideal, but as an instinctive response to having been opened by our own suffering. Pain also offers us the chance to realign with what actually matters. In periods of comfort, it is easy to become entangled in goals that are external, performative, or built from comparison. We may pursue validation, status, approval, or belonging in ways that move us away from our deeper values. When pain interrupts these pursuits, it encourages us to slow down and reflect. We begin to ask questions about what is meaningful to us. The answers may not come immediately, but pain creates the space for those answers to form. In this sense, pain is not the experience of life going wrong. It is the experience of being invited to live more honestly, more attentively, more sincerely. It is a call to examine what we have accepted as true without questioning whether it actually supports our well-being. It is the beginning of a shift from living automatically to living consciously. There will still be moments when the pain feels heavy, and there is no need to pretend otherwise. But with time, we learn that discomfort does not overwhelm us. We learn that the heart is capable of holding more than we once believed. We learn that healing is not a return to who we were, but the emergence of who we are becoming. The invitation of pain is simply to notice, to remain present, and to allow the experience to teach us something about ourselves that we were not ready to know before. It is not easy, but it is meaningful. And it marks the beginning of a deeper relationship with life itself. Chapter 3. The self you thought you were. There is a version of ourselves that forms gradually as we grow. A kind of inner portrait composed from the expectations of family, the opinions of peers, the lessons we absorb from culture, and the quiet personal experiences that shape how we interpret the world. This version of the self begins to feel familiar, almost as though it is the only possible way to be. We come to believe that this is who we truly are. We carry this identity into relationships, decisions, and dreams, and we rarely stop to question where it came from or whether it reflects something genuine beneath the surface. It becomes the shell we move through life wearing, not as a disguise exactly, but as a default expression of ourselves that feels rehearsed and predictable. Alan Watts often suggested that the self is not a fixed object, but a continuous process, something fluid that changes in response to experience, environment, and inner understanding. Yet most of us develop an identity as though it were something solid and permanent, something we must protect and maintain. We learn how to present ourselves in ways that gain approval or prevent rejection. We learn to avoid certain emotions because they conflict with the image we are trying to hold. We learn to say what is expected rather than what is true. And all of this happens so quietly that it feels natural, even when it limits us. Then there comes a point when the identity we have been holding no longer fits. Sometimes this shift is immediate, brought on by loss or change that disrupts our sense of stability. Other times it unfolds slowly, through a growing sense that the person we are performing is out of alignment with what we feel inside. This recognition does not always arrive in language. It may first appear as restlessness, as a heaviness in the body, as a lack of energy toward things that once motivated us, or as a subtle disinterest in continuing to play the roles we once embraced. The discomfort is not a failure. It is a sign that the old identity has reached its limit. When the self we thought we were begins to dissolve, the experience can be disorienting. The familiar sense of who we are becomes blurry. Thoughts that once felt stable lose their clarity. Behaviors that once felt effortless now require energy. The mind tries to hold on, to reconstruct the old identity, to return to a sense of certainty. It asks questions like, what happened to me? Why am I not who I used to be? Why does everything feel different? The instinct is to repair the old structure. But the dissolution is not happening because something went wrong. It is happening because we are growing in ways the previous identity cannot contain. This stage often brings vulnerability to the surface. Without the old identity to protect us, we become more aware of emotions that had been set aside. Fear, longing, confusion, tenderness. These feelings emerge because there is now space for them. The absence of the old self creates room for the unedited experience of being alive. It can feel overwhelming, but it is also the beginning of authenticity. We are no longer operating from a script. We are simply experiencing. There is a moment in this process when we must decide how to relate to the change. We can try to rebuild the old identity, tightening the shell and reinforcing the familiar structures so that we can continue to live in predictability. Or we can allow the dissolution to continue, trusting that something more aligned, more honest, and more spacious will form. The second option requires a kind of gentle courage. It is not dramatic. It is more like learning to breathe through uncertainty, allowing the transition to unfold without rushing to define ourselves again. As this unfolding continues, we begin to see how much of our previous identity was shaped by external influences. We notice how certain traits were developed to please others, how certain ambitions were adopted to appear successful, how certain emotional responses were suppressed because they seemed inconvenient. This realization is not meant to create guilt or regret. It simply reveals how adaptive we are as human beings, how deeply we are shaped by connection and environment. And with this awareness comes the opportunity to choose differently. The self that is emerging is not something we must invent. It does not require performance or construction. It is revealed gradually through the act of listening to ourselves more carefully. We pay attention to what feels natural rather than what feels expected. We notice what brings a sense of ease rather than tension. We begin to respond rather than impress. The new identity does not arrive all at once. It forms slowly, like a photograph developing in water, shapes appearing before they become distinct. One of the most important understandings in this process is that identity is not something to be finalized. There is no finished version of who we are. Life continues to change us. Experiences continue to shape us. Relationships continue to open and challenge us. The self is a process of continuous unfolding. When we release the need to be a fixed person, we gain the freedom to be real. The self you thought you were was not a mistake. It was simply the version that formed under the conditions that existed at the time. Now, new conditions are asking for a new expression. The change is not a loss of identity. It is the evolution of identity. And the more we allow the process to unfold, the more we begin to feel like we are finally meeting ourselves. Chapter 4. The Art of Letting Go. There comes a point in the process of inner change when we are asked to release our grip on something we have been holding on to for a long time. This something may be a belief about who we are, a relationship that once felt defining, a narrative about how life should unfold, or a memory of a time when things seemed simpler or more certain. Letting go is rarely about the physical absence of a person or situation. More often, it is an internal shift, a quiet loosening of the emotional attachment that once shaped how we thought, behaved, and understood ourselves. Letting go is difficult not because it is unnatural, but because the mind is designed to seek familiarity. Even when the familiar causes tension or pain, it can still feel safer than stepping into an unknown space within ourselves. The mind tries to hold on to what has already been lived because it interprets predictability as protection. This is why letting go often feels like a kind of death, not of the self as a whole, but of the story we once used to organize our life. The identity we wore, the roles we played, the emotions we relied on to navigate the world. All of these begin to dissolve when the moment of release arrives. Alan Watts often described the nature of life as something fluid, like a river that is always moving. To resist change is to grip the riverbank, believing we can stop the current through force or intention. But the river does not stop. It continues moving, carrying us whether we are willing to flow with it or not. Letting go in this sense is less about choosing to release something and more about recognizing that holding on is no longer possible without creating suffering. The river has already moved. We are simply acknowledging the movement. When something within us begins to shift, the instinct to return to what is familiar can feel strong. We may try to recreate past emotional states, repeat old patterns, or revive relationships that have already transitioned into different forms. We may revisit memories, using them as evidence that things were once clear and secure. Yet when we look closely, we can see that the memory itself has changed. The past does not return in its original shape. It only appears as a reflection in the mind, filtered through time and perspective. Letting go does not mean rejecting the past. It means acknowledging that the past cannot be lived again. There is often grief in this realization, even if the change is ultimately growth. The grief is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is quiet, felt as a subtle ache that lingers in the background of daily life. It may show up as a heaviness when we wake in the morning, or a tender sensitivity that appears unexpectedly during ordinary interactions. This grief is a natural part of transformation. It marks the end of a chapter, not because the chapter was wrong, but because it is complete. Letting go requires patience. It does not happen in a single moment of insight. Even when the mind understands that something has ended, the emotional body may take longer to adjust. During this period, we may move back and forth between acceptance and resistance, clarity and confusion, openness and fear. This movement is not a sign of failure. It is simply the nervous system recalibrating to a new reality. The process of release unfolds gradually, like the tide withdrawing from the shore, not in a single motion, but in a series of subtle retreats. As the grip loosens, something begins to change inside us. Space opens. The tension that once filled the inner landscape begins to soften. Thoughts that were rigid become more fluid. The body feels less guarded, less prepared to defend or protect. In this space, we begin to sense ourselves more directly. without the distortion of old attachment. It is not an immediate arrival into peace. It is a slow emergence into clarity. Letting go also creates room for a more authentic relationship with life. When we are no longer trying to force experience to match what we desire or expect, we become more receptive to what is actually present. We begin to navigate relationships with greater honesty because we are no longer acting to preserve a role or identity. We listen more deeply because we are not using the conversation to confirm our narrative. We make choices that align with our well-being because we are not trying to maintain a story that has already ended. There is a quiet strength in this openness. It does not look like confidence in the outward sense. It is not loud or assertive. Instead, it is a steady willingness to let life move through us without needing to control every outcome. It is the recognition that life has its own rhythm and that our role is not to dominate that rhythm, but to move with it in a way that honors both our inner truth and the flow of the world around us. Letting go is not about forgetting. It is not about dismissing the importance of what has been experienced. Everything that has shaped us continues to exist as part of our inner landscape. But the weight of those experiences changes when we stop holding them as identity. They become memory rather than definition. They become chapters rather than the whole book. With time, the space created by letting go does not feel empty. It begins to feel spacious. It becomes a place where new forms of self can emerge, not forced or constructed, but allowed to appear naturally. The river continues flowing, and we learn to move with it not because we have surrendered in defeat, but because we have recognized that life has always been moving in this way. Letting go is simply the act of remembering that we were never meant to remain the same. Chapter 5. Emptiness as spaciousness. There is a particular stage in personal transformation that many people experience but often struggle to understand, because it does not resemble the popular images of change we are familiar with. When people think about growth, they often imagine breakthroughs, clarity, empowerment, and renewed direction. They imagine rising from difficulty the way a story character rises at the end of a film. Yet actual growth is rarely so cinematic. Instead, there is usually a quieter and more ambiguous phase that follows the release of an old identity or attachment. In this phase, the emotional intensity that once defined our inner world begins to soften, and what remains is a kind of emptiness that does not initially feel comforting. It is a space that is open, quiet, and unfamiliar. Many people interpret this emptiness as something lacking, as if life has taken away more than it has given. However, this emptiness is not a loss. It is an opening. This emptiness appears most clearly in the moments after something has been let go. When we release something that once shaped the structure of our emotional lives, whether it is a relationship, a deeply held belief, an aspiration that no longer fits our inner direction, or a version of ourselves that we have been carrying for many years, the space it occupied becomes noticeable. The sense of identity that once held us together loosens, and for a while there is no new structure to replace it. This is not a sign that something is wrong. It is a natural phase of transition that most people are not taught to recognize. The reason emptiness feels unsettling is that the mind is accustomed to identifying itself with form. We are used to having clear emotional narratives. We are used to knowing what we are striving for. We are used to defining ourselves through relationships, memories, habits, and roles. When these familiar reference points dissolve, the mind does not know where to locate itself. It tries to grasp onto something recognizable. It searches for the old patterns, the previous attachments, the familiar emotional climate, not because those patterns were healthy or aligned, but because they were known. The unfamiliar can feel threatening even when it is necessary for growth. Alan Watts often described the idea of emptiness in a way that differs from the negative connotations it holds in many Western perspectives. In many Eastern philosophical traditions, emptiness is not understood as a void or absence. It is understood as spaciousness, potential, and openness. It is the space in which new life can form. It is the stillness that allows movement to be perceived, the silence that allows sound to be heard, the background that gives shape to experience. Without emptiness, nothing could emerge, because emergence requires space. However, when we first encounter this spaciousness in our inner world, it does not feel expansive. It feels unfamiliar because we are used to filling our inner experience with motion, emotion, narrative, or identity. We are used to being in constant psychological conversation with ourselves. When that conversation goes quiet, even temporarily, the stillness can feel like disorientation. Many people describe this phase as feeling like they are floating without direction or purpose. They may feel disconnected from activities that once motivated them. They may find themselves less interested in producing or achieving, yet not sure what they are meant to do instead. This can lead to a sense of frustration or confusion, not because something is wrong, but because the mind has not yet learned how to interpret spaciousness without assuming it must be filled. If we rush to fill the emptiness, we often recreate the very patterns that once restricted us. Many people, when confronted with this space, feel compelled to form a new relationship quickly, take on a new identity or role, or pursue a new emotional intensity simply to avoid the discomfort of being in transition. However, the spaciousness is necessary. It is the interval in which we learn to listen rather than perform. Without allowing this space, we do not have the opportunity to discover what is actually emerging from within us. We simply replace one familiar pattern with another. This stage of emptiness invites a different way of relating to our inner world. Instead of treating the absence of old structure as a problem to solve, we are asked to learn how to be with ourselves without the constant reinforcement of identity or external direction. This does not happen quickly. It requires patience, not in the sense of waiting for something to happen, but in the sense of allowing life to unfold without forcing it to move faster than it needs to. During this time, the nervous system is recalibrating. The emotions are reorganizing. The mind is learning how to rest instead of continually grasping. The self is shifting from constructed identity to genuine awareness. One of the first changes that begins to emerge during this period is a subtle shift in perception. When we are no longer preoccupied with maintaining old patterns, we begin to notice details that were previously overlooked. This noticing is not dramatic. It is quiet and gradual. We begin to sense small moments throughout the day that feel meaningful without needing to be significant. The sound of wind passing through leaves, the way light moves across a room, the rhythmic sensation of breathing, the experience of being in the presence of another person without needing to respond or perform. These experiences do not announce themselves as insights. They simply reveal that life is richer than the narratives we once used to define it. The emptiness also allows us to become aware of the difference between desire that arises from habit and desire that arises from inner alignment. When the emotional and mental noise settles, We can sense what does and does not feel true. We begin to notice which activities bring a natural sense of ease and which ones feel forced. We notice where tension arises and where it dissolves. We begin to recognize the ways we have shaped ourselves out of obligation rather than authenticity. This recognition does not need to be acted upon immediately. It simply needs to be acknowledged. The spaciousness creates room for this acknowledgement. As time passes, the emptiness begins to feel less like a void and more like a foundation. The stillness becomes familiar. The quiet no longer signals absence. It signals presence. Not the presence of identity or performance, but the presence of awareness. This awareness does not require explanation. It simply exists as a place within us that does not need to prove or assert itself. It is a stable ground that does not depend on external conditions. Eventually, new forms begin to emerge. A new sense of direction may take shape, not as a sudden realization, but as a gradual orientation towards something that feels genuine. Relationships may shift into more honest patterns. Work may move towards something meaningful rather than something performative. The self that emerges from this spaciousness is not a constructed identity. It is not defined by what others see. It is something known quietly from within, something that does not need to hold itself tightly in order to exist. The emptiness was not emptiness, it was room. It is in this room that the self grows into something real. Chapter 6. The Gentle Eyes of Compassion. There is something that happens to a person who has experienced pain deeply and has remained with that pain long enough to understand it, rather than simply react to it. The experience changes the way they see others. It alters the way they listen, the way they interpret behavior, the way they respond to emotional cues, and the way they hold space for the experiences of those around them. This shift does not announce itself with clarity, and it is not something that a person usually decides consciously. Instead, it is something that arises quietly over time, as if life has softened the edges of the heart by passing through it again and again. When someone has been broken open by suffering, they begin to recognize that pain is not a rare or personal flaw, but a universal condition of being human. This recognition does not occur as a concept or belief. It emerges through lived experience, through nights when the heart feels heavy without an obvious reason, through the slow navigation of grief or loss, through the subtle and private moments when one realizes that certain hopes or images of self will not be returned in the form they once existed. These experiences create depth, not because suffering is noble in itself, but because suffering creates space inside the heart, where understanding can take root. Alan Watts often spoke about the illusion of separateness, the idea that individuals walk through the world believing themselves to be isolated beings with independent emotional realities, when in truth there is a continuous thread of shared human experience that connects us beneath the surface. Most of the time, this thread remains unseen because we are preoccupied with our own concerns, fears, goals, and identities. It is not that people are selfish intentionally. It is simply that the internal world tends to become a place of focus when life is moving quickly. However, when suffering slows us down, we begin to see more clearly. The world becomes less about me and more about us, not as a philosophical statement, but as a real shift in perception. The person who has suffered does not look at another's pain and think that it is trivial or unnecessary. Instead, the recognition is immediate and instinctive. There is a quiet understanding that pain is always significant to the one experiencing it, regardless of its external form. There is no need to compare difficulties or categorize suffering into degrees of legitimacy. Instead, there is the understanding that pain is pain, fear is fear, loss is loss. The shapes these emotions take may differ, but the emotional weight they carry is something universal. This understanding is what gives rise to compassion. Compassion is not pity. Pity creates separation. It assumes a hierarchy in which one person is stable and the other is broken. Compassion does not place people on opposite sides of an emotional divide. Compassion is the recognition that we all move through life with the same vulnerability, the same uncertainty, the same longing to be seen and understood. It is the awareness that the emotional world is fragile, and that this fragility is not a failure, but an inherent part of being alive. The eyes of someone who has known suffering do not look at others looking for flaws or weaknesses to evaluate or judge. Instead, the gaze softens. The sensitivity to tone, to expression, to hesitation, to everything unspoken becomes sharper. When someone speaks, the words are heard, but so is the silence beneath them. When someone withdraws, the withdrawal is felt before it is explained. When someone is overwhelmed, the overwhelmed state is recognized before it becomes visible. This capacity to perceive subtle emotional shifts is not something learned through technique. It emerges naturally because the person has learned to perceive those same subtle shifts within themselves. The world becomes more textured and nuanced. Conversations are no longer simply exchanges of information. They become shared experiences of feeling. The goal is not to fix, not to solve, not to offer lessons or solutions, but to be present in a way that allows the other person to remain whole, even in their vulnerability. This presence is quiet. It does not interrupt. It does not hurry. It does not try to guide the emotional experience toward a conclusion. It allows space for whatever is happening to unfold without interference. This way of being can sometimes feel invisible because it is not something that calls attention to itself. There is no performance. There is no display of empathy. There is simply a way of seeing that allows others to feel seen without having to explain themselves. The person who has known suffering becomes a place of rest for others, not because they provide answers, but because they are comfortable in the presence of emotional complexity. They are no longer afraid of sadness or confusion or uncertainty, because they This does not mean that the person who has known suffering becomes passive or without boundaries. On the contrary, compassion requires clarity. When someone has spent time understanding their own emotional landscape, they become aware of what is theirs to carry and what is not. They do not take on responsibility for the emotional worlds of others, because they understand that each person is walking their own path. They simply offer the presence that allows others to walk that path with a little more steadiness. Boundaries do not interfere with compassion. They protect it. They ensure that compassion remains a form of connection rather than sacrifice. Over time, this way of seeing becomes natural. The world feels less hostile. People feel less threatening. Situations feel less personal. The emotional environment becomes something to observe rather than react to. The heart becomes less concerned with being right, with being understood, with being seen a certain way. Instead, the heart becomes concerned with understanding, with meaning, with sincerity. The pace of interaction slows. The inner world becomes quiet enough to notice the subtle movements of others. Suffering does not automatically create compassion. It is possible for suffering to lead to defensiveness, bitterness, and closure. Compassion emerges only when suffering is met with awareness rather than avoidance, when pain is allowed to soften rather than harden. The softening is not immediate, it is gradual. It occurs when the person stops fighting their experience and allows themselves to feel fully. The world opens from the inside. The gentle eyes of compassion do not look for difference. They look for the shared thread. They recognize that every person carries something invisible. They understand that behind strength there is vulnerability, and behind vulnerability there is humanity. This recognition changes the way we move through the world. We no longer feel the need to prove ourselves. We no longer feel the need to protect ourselves from every emotional possibility. We begin to trust that openness is not a threat. It is a way of being that allows life to pass through us without becoming trapped. Compassion is not something we create. It is something we uncover once pain has opened the heart. Chapter 7. The sensitivity of the wounded. When a person has been broken open by their own experiences, something shifts in the way they perceive the world. The shift is not loud. It does not appear as a dramatic insight or a decision that is consciously made. It happens gradually, without announcement, as if the emotional landscape of the individual has become more spacious, more receptive, and more finely attuned to subtle changes. This sensitivity is not something sought out intentionally. It is something that develops naturally when the structures that once protected the heart have softened. The very experience of being wounded reshapes the inner world in such a way that perception becomes more refined. Not because the person wants to be more aware, but because awareness has nowhere left to hide. Most people grow up learning how to create some form of emotional distance between themselves and the world. This distance serves a purpose. It protects us during moments when we feel overwhelmed, frightened, judged, or uncertain. It allows us to move through life with a sense of stability. Yet when suffering arrives, and we are forced to confront our inner world directly, that distance often collapses. The emotional boundaries that once shielded us begin to feel thin. We become more permeable. The world begins to reach us more easily. And at first, this can feel like vulnerability in the most uncomfortable sense. The heart feels exposed, and the emotional environment appears louder than before. However, as time passes and the person learns to remain with their own emotional experience rather than resisting it, this permeability becomes something else. It turns into a form of sensitivity that allows for deeper understanding. The person who has suffered begins to notice things that others overlook. The tone of someone's voice becomes as meaningful as the words they speak. The way someone pauses in conversation reveals as much as the statements they make. The way a person places their hands. The way their eyes shift slightly when certain topics are mentioned. The way silence hangs in the air when something important has not yet been expressed. All of this becomes visible. This kind of sensitivity is not analytical. It is not about reading people or studying behavior. It is a natural awareness that comes from having spent time within one's own unfiltered emotional depths. When a person has been required to face themselves, their fears, their disappointments, their grief, and their confusion, they develop a deeper understanding of what pain looks like in all its variations. They recognize what emotional hesitation feels like because they have felt it in themselves. They recognize the quiet ways people hold back tears because they have held back their own. They recognize the way someone's voice softens when they are trying not to break. And this recognition does not lead to judgment. It leads to closeness. Yet sensitivity of this kind is often misunderstood, especially by those who have not undergone a similar process of introspection. In cultures that emphasize independence, emotional control, confidence, and self-sufficiency, sensitivity can appear as fragility. People may associate emotional permeability with weakness, or they may believe that being affected by the feelings of others means lacking stability. However, the sensitivity that emerges after suffering is not fragility. It is the opposite. It is strength developed from the willingness to remain open rather than closing in response to pain. Strength, in this sense, is not the absence of vulnerability. It is the capacity to remain present with vulnerability without being overwhelmed by it. It is the ability to feel deeply without collapsing and to observe emotional movement without needing to control it. The person who has developed this kind of sensitivity has spent time in the inner world long enough to recognize that emotions rise and fall like weather, and that resisting these movements creates suffering, while allowing them to unfold creates space. This space allows the person to remain grounded in situations where others may feel compelled to retreat, defend, or react. They can sit with tension without rushing to resolve it. They can hear someone's pain without needing to fix it. They can recognize discomfort in another person without needing to interpret it as personal rejection. This ability to remain steady while also remaining receptive is what makes sensitivity such a powerful form of awareness. However, this sensitivity also comes with responsibilities. When a person can perceive the emotional states of others so clearly, there can be a temptation to take on the emotional weight of those around them. There can be a habit of stepping forward to comfort, to soften, to carry, or to protect. While this impulse comes from a genuine place of empathy, it can lead to exhaustion if the person has not learned how to distinguish between awareness and responsibility. Awareness allows one to see. Responsibility attempts to hold. The person who has developed sensitivity must learn that seeing does not require caring. They can care deeply without absorbing the emotional burdens of others. This distinction requires time to embody. It involves developing boundaries that are not rigid walls, but natural edges. Boundaries shaped by awareness rather than fear. Boundaries that arise not to close the heart, but to ensure that the compassion the person offers remains sustainable. Once this balance is understood, sensitivity becomes a gift not only to others, but to the person themselves. They begin to navigate the world with a sense of gentle presence. They are not thrown off balance as easily. They feel more connected to what is real rather than what is performed. They experience relationships in a way that feels grounded and sincere rather than rushed or forced. Over time, this sensitivity becomes a way of being. It is not something the person uses or applies. It is simply who they are now. They interact with others with a kind of quiet respect for the emotional complexity that every human carries. They speak more slowly, not because they are hesitant, but because they are thoughtful. They choose words that do not harm. They listen with full attention, not because they are trying to perform empathy, but because they genuinely care. Their presence softens rooms without effort. They make others feel more comfortable simply by existing in a way that welcomes sincerity. The sensitivity of the wounded is not dramatic. It is not loud. It is not noticeable at first glance. It is a subtle quality of presence, a way of being that acknowledges the shared fragility of human experience. It does not seek recognition. It does not require validation. It simply exists as a natural consequence of having felt deeply and remained open. It is the sensitivity of someone who has met themselves. And because they have met themselves, they can meet others. Chapter 8. When silence speaks, there comes a time in a person's life when silence begins to carry meaning in a way it never did before. Not the silence that comes from a lack of words, nor the silence of avoidance or withdrawal, but a deeper silence that arises naturally when the inner noise begins to settle. This silence does not announce itself as something profound. It arrives quietly, sometimes in the middle of an ordinary day, sometimes in the pause between one thought and the next. At first, it may feel unfamiliar, because most of us have lived with an internal dialogue for so long that we have forgotten what it is like to be present without commentary. The mind narrates, the mind interprets, the mind anticipates, the mind reacts. It becomes difficult to encounter life directly when this internal narration never stops. When a person has passed through pain, when they have experienced the dissolution of identity, the quieting of attachment, and the spaciousness that follows, something changes in their relationship to silence. They no longer seek to fill every empty moment with sound, with activity, with conversation, or with distraction. The silence that once felt like emptiness now begins to feel like a form of clarity. It is in this clarity that perception deepens. The world becomes less filtered by expectation, less shaped by assumption, less interpreted through the lens of personal narrative. The silence allows life to appear as it is, without the mind insisting that it must mean something. Alan Watts often spoke about the difference between hearing and listening. Hearing is automatic. It requires no attention. But listening, real listening, requires a kind of stillness inside. When a person listens, they are not preparing to respond. They are not interpreting in order to categorize. They are allowing something to present itself without interference. Silence is what makes this type of listening possible. Silence is not the absence of sound. It is the absence of internal resistance. When the mind becomes quieter, the world begins to speak in more subtle ways. The sound of footsteps in another room, the distant hum of traffic, the rustling of leaves, the tone of someone's voice, the slight change in their breathing, the pause they take before answering. All of these become meaningful, not because they carry hidden messages, but because they reflect reality as it unfolds. The person who has learned to listen in silence does not search for significance. They simply notice. This noticing creates a sense of connection to life that is different from the connection that comes from thinking about life. In conversation, silence becomes a space where intimacy can form. Most people are uncomfortable with silence when speaking with others. They rush to fill it, fearing that the absence of sound suggests disinterest or awkwardness. But when someone has grown comfortable with silence, they begin to understand that silence is not a void to be filled. It is a space that allows truth to emerge. People speak differently when they know they are not forced to perform. They slow down. They choose words more carefully. They say what they actually mean rather than what they think they should say. Silence invites authenticity. The one who listens in silence becomes someone others feel safe with, often without knowing why. There is no pressure to impress, no pressure to entertain, no pressure to explain oneself completely. The silence holds what is shared, allowing it to simply be. In this space, people reveal themselves without realizing they are doing so because silence has given them permission to breathe. Yet this silence is not only relevant in relationships. It also applies to the relationship one has with themselves. When inner noise begins to fade, a gentle clarity arises that does not depend on reasoning or analysis. It is possible to sense what feels honest without needing to justify it. It is possible to understand what direction to take without needing to articulate a reason. The silence becomes a place of inner orientation. It does not provide answers in the way the mind often demands. Instead, it provides a sense of alignment, a sense of what feels true, a sense of what is no longer necessary to carry. This is why silence can feel so expansive. There is room to notice thoughts arising without being pulled into them. There is room to experience emotion without being overwhelmed by it. There is room to respond to life rather than react. The silence does not eliminate thought or emotion. It simply creates distance between awareness and experience, allowing both to exist without conflict. However, reaching this silence is not something that can be forced. If someone attempts to quiet the mind through effort, the effort itself becomes noise. The silence arises naturally when the mind has released its grip on control. It cannot be manufactured. It can only be allowed. This allowing comes from having seen the limits of the mind's attempts to manage life. When a person has experienced the collapse of old identities and the failure of old strategies of self-protection, they begin to let go not because they want to, but because they finally understand that holding on no longer works. It is in this release that silence enters. The silence is also where emotional truth becomes clearer. Without the noise of justification, self-protection, expectation, and internal commentary, emotions reveal themselves in their simplest form. There is sadness without the story of sadness. There is longing without the narrative that accompanies longing. There is joy without the fear of losing joy. Emotions become experiences rather than identities. They move through the body the way clouds move across the sky. The silence allows them to pass without becoming trapped. This does not mean the person no longer feels deeply. On the contrary, they feel more deeply than before. But the depth is no longer overwhelming. It is spacious. The silence holds the emotion the way a wide landscape holds the movement of wind. There is room for everything, and nothing needs to be controlled. Eventually, silence becomes something the person seeks not out of necessity, but out of affinity. It becomes a familiar environment, a place of rest. The world continues to move quickly. People continue to speak loudly. Expectations continue to arise. But the silence remains available beneath it all, like a quiet well that one can return to simply by remembering that it exists. This kind of silence does not require isolation from others or withdrawal from the world. It is a silence that can exist in the middle of conversation, in the middle of work, in the middle of movement. It is an inner stillness rather than external quiet. It is the recognition that awareness does not need to chase every thought, every sound, every emotion. Awareness can remain steady while experience continues. The silence is where the self begins to feel whole. Not because life is resolved, not because uncertainty has disappeared, but because the need to escape experience has dissolved. It is in silence that the heart learns how to rest. Chapter 9. The fear of being seen. There is a moment in personal transformation when the protective shell that once shaped how we moved through the world begins to soften. And although this softening is necessary for growth, it also brings forward a particular kind of vulnerability that can feel surprisingly difficult to navigate. The vulnerability is not simply emotional openness, nor is it the willingness to express feelings or speak truth. It is something quieter, something more subtle, something that has to do with being visible in a way that cannot be controlled. It is the experience of being seen as we actually are, without the layers we once relied on to manage how the world perceived us. For much of our lives, we learn how to curate ourselves. We are influenced by families, social environments, cultural norms, and the unwritten expectations that guide which parts of us are welcomed and which parts are met with silence or disapproval. We develop ways of speaking, ways of responding, ways of smiling, ways of presenting confidence or composure, all shaped by a desire to belong and to avoid emotional harm. The identities that emerge from this process are not false because they are built from real experiences, yet they are incomplete. They represent a portion of us, but not the full depth of our interior world. When pain breaks through the identity we have constructed, when a loss, a heartbreak, a collapse of certainty, or a shift in self-awareness opens something inside of us that we can no longer avoid, the distance between the inner self and the outer self narrows. The emotions that once stayed beneath the surface rise closer to awareness. The truths we avoided become harder to ignore. The longing for sincerity grows stronger. And yet, at the very same time, the fear of letting these deeper parts of ourselves be visible also grows. This fear does not arise because there is something wrong with us. It arises because at some earlier point in life, we learned that being fully seen can be dangerous. Perhaps we expressed our needs and were told they were excessive. Perhaps we expressed sorrow and were encouraged to quiet it. Perhaps we expressed joy and were told not to draw attention. Perhaps we expressed love and were not met in return. The nervous system remembers these moments. It begins to associate exposure with pain. So the heart learns to protect itself, not through avoidance of others, but through the careful shaping of the self that is shown to others. When the inner world begins to open, this learned protection comes into conflict with the desire to live authentically. A part of us wants to speak, to reveal, to share the truth of who we are. Another part of us hesitates, holding back, waiting for signs of safety. The tension between longing for connection and fearing exposure creates an emotional threshold that cannot be crossed by force. It must be moved through gradually, with patience, attention, and a willingness to understand the fear rather than attempt to overcome it. Alan Watts often spoke of the self not as a fixed structure, but as a process that unfolds through experience. The fear of being seen is strongest when we believe the self is fragile, something that can be damaged or invalidated by how others respond to us. However, when the self is understood as something fluid and living, something that continues to change and grow regardless of external perception, the fear begins to lose its urgency. But this understanding does not come only from thought. It must be lived. The first step is recognizing that the fear of being seen is not an obstacle to remove, but a signal that we are nearing something meaningful. The fear points toward a part of us that is real, a part that has not been shared, a part that matters. If it did not matter, there would be no fear surrounding it. The presence of fear indicates value. When we acknowledge this, the fear becomes less of an enemy and more of a companion in the process of opening. The second step is learning to distinguish between the desire to be understood and the desire to be approved. Approval depends on performance. Understanding depends on honesty. When we begin to share ourselves without aiming to be admired, accepted, or validated, but simply to be recognized, the act of being seen loses some of its intensity. We are not trying to shape the outcome. We are simply allowing ourselves to exist in connection. Yet this does not mean that we should reveal our inner world everywhere. Sensitivity requires discernment. Being seen is meaningful only when the person on the other side is capable of receiving what is shared with respect. Not everyone has the capacity to meet vulnerability with care. Therefore, the process of allowing ourselves to be seen is not about removing all boundaries. It is about forming boundaries based on truth rather than fear. We do not close ourselves to the world. We simply choose where and with whom we unfold. As we practice this, something begins to change. The fear does not disappear completely. Instead, it becomes less constricting. It becomes something we can hold rather than something that holds us. When we speak honestly, even in small ways, the body gradually learns that expression does not always result in rejection. When we allow ourselves to be quiet instead of performing, the nervous system learns that presence does not need justification. When we allow emotion to be visible without explanation, we learn that vulnerability is not a collapse, but a form of clarity. Over time, the fear of being seen transforms into the capacity to remain present while being seen. The heart no longer rushes to close. The mind no longer searches for the safest version of self to present. The breath does not tighten when someone looks closely. There is space to simply exist in relationship without pretense. This does not create a life without difficulty. It creates a life in which difficulty can be shared. And that changes everything. Being seen becomes less about exposure and more about connection. Less about risk and more about belonging. Less about performance and more about presence. And slowly, the self feels less like something to defend and more like something to live from. Chapter 10. Love after pain. There is a way that love feels before a person has moved through deep pain. And there is a way that love feels afterward. And the difference between the two is not simply emotional maturity or experience, but something deeper and quieter, something that lives in the nervous system and in the emotional body. When love is first discovered earlier in life, it often arrives with intensity, urgency, infatuation, and a kind of overwhelming longing that seems to promise transformation. This early form of love feels expansive and consuming, as though the presence of another person could complete what feels unfinished inside us, or steady what feels unsteady. It is not a shallow love, and it is not foolish. It is simply love that has not yet encountered what happens when the heart breaks open. When a person experiences heartbreak in a way that forces them to sit with themselves rather than escape themselves, something changes in how they approach love later. The moment of heartbreak itself may feel catastrophic, as if the identity that once held everything together has unraveled. Yet over time, if the person remains with the experience rather than rejecting it, they begin to understand that the pain is not punishment and not loss without meaning. It is the collapse of an idea of love that was based on seeking completion. The person learns that no one else can fill the empty spaces within them permanently, no matter how intense the connection may be. They learn that love cannot replace the relationship one has with oneself. This realization does not make them colder or more distant. It makes them more honest. After pain, love begins from a different place. It does not begin with urgency or the desire to merge. It begins with noticing. The person pays attention to how they feel in the presence of the other, not whether the other fulfills a longing or a story. They notice whether their body contracts or relaxes, whether their speech becomes performative or natural, whether their attention feels scattered or grounded. These signals are subtle, but they are reliable because they come from the nervous system rather than from fantasy or expectation. Love after pain is slower not because the person is afraid, but because they are aware. There is often a period of quietness at the beginning of love after suffering. The person may hesitate before revealing themselves fully, not out of fear of being close, but out of respect for the depth of what connection means. They understand that the heart is not a place to rush. They understand that emotional intimacy grows through time, through shared presence, through trust that is built slowly rather than promised quickly. They understand that love is not something that needs to prove itself through intensity. It reveals itself through consistency. In this stage, love feels less like being lifted out of oneself and more like being brought back into oneself. The person does not look for the other to complete them, because they have already met the parts of themselves that felt incomplete. They have sat with their loneliness, with their longing, with their grief, and through sitting with it, they have learned that these experiences do not destroy them. This gives them the ability to remain in love without clinging. They can love without losing themselves. This does not mean that love becomes emotionless or reserved. In fact, love after pain can be more tender, more gentle, and more deeply felt than the urgent love that comes before it. The difference is that the tenderness is not based on fear of loss or fear of abandonment. It is based on presence. The tenderness is not a performance. It is simply the natural way the heart responds when it no longer needs to defend itself. This form of love also involves boundaries. The person who has moved through suffering understands that their well-being is their own responsibility, and they do not enter relationships expecting someone else to maintain their emotional balance. They care, they support, they listen, and they share, but they do not collapse into the other. They do not confuse connection with dependency. They understand that two people can be close while remaining distinct, and that this distinction is necessary for love to remain clear and alive. Communication in love after pain becomes slower and more thoughtful. The person is less concerned with being right or being understood immediately. They are more concerned with staying connected, even during difficult conversations. They speak from a place of sincerity rather than defensiveness. They listen with the intention to understand rather than to respond. They do not use silence as withdrawal nor speech as control. The relationship becomes an environment in which both people can breathe. There is also a different relationship with uncertainty. In earlier forms of love, uncertainty can feel threatening, as though any moment of doubt or distance could mean collapse. After pain, uncertainty becomes something to move with rather than resist. The person understands that emotions change, that closeness expands and contracts, that people need space, that silence is not a sign of abandonment. They do not panic when things shift, because they have already lived through internal shifts far greater than the ones that arise in ordinary relational movement. The ability to remain steady during emotional fluctuation creates a foundation of safety, and safety is what allows intimacy to deepen. Love after pain does not rush to define itself. It does not need labels to feel real. It does not need intensity to feel meaningful. The meaning comes from presence itself. It comes from being able to look at the other person without needing them to perform anything. It comes from being able to sit in silence together without needing to fill it. It comes from knowing that closeness does not require constant effort, only genuine attention. The love becomes something that grows over time rather than something that appears suddenly. It grows through shared mornings, shared meals, shared quiet, shared difficulties, shared softness. It grows when two people allow themselves to be ordinary together. It grows when neither person tries to be impressive. It grows when both people allow space for the other to have an inner life of their own. Love after pain is not love that avoids vulnerability. It is love that understands vulnerability. It is love that does not disappear when fear arises. It is love that remains steady not because nothing is ever shaken, but because both people are willing to stay present while it shakes. This kind of love is not dramatic. It is not cinematic. It is real. It is the kind of love that stays. It is the kind of love that breathes. It is the kind of love that does not need to prove itself. Chapter 11. Turning toward life again. There comes a stage in the process of healing when something begins to stir inside, something quiet and almost imperceptible at first. It does not arrive as excitement or inspiration, and it does not resemble the optimism that may have existed before pain reshaped the inner world. It is softer than that, quieter, more cautious, more grounded. It is the beginning of turning toward life again. This shift does not happen in a single moment, and it does not announce itself clearly. It begins as a subtle loosening, a softening of the emotional landscape, a recognition that the heaviness which once felt permanent has begun to thin just enough to allow the possibility of movement. After pain, there is often a period of stillness, where life feels suspended and the world seems to continue without us. During this time, it can be difficult to imagine returning to joy or connection or interest in the ordinary rhythms of living. The body holds its own memory of what was lost. The mind hesitates to rush into anything new. The heart remains unsure of how open it is willing to be. This stillness is necessary because it allows the nervous system to recalibrate and the emotional body to find its own rhythm again. There is no timeline for how long this stillness lasts. It is not something to push or accelerate. It unfolds at the pace the body can support. Turning toward life again begins when the stillness no longer feels like a refuge, but begins to feel like a preparation. Something inside starts to shift from withdrawal to curiosity. The curiosity may be small at first. It may appear in the form of noticing beauty again, not with intensity, but with a quiet awareness. The light in the early morning, the sound of someone laughing nearby, the texture of warm water on the hands while washing dishes. These moments arrive gently, and they do not demand anything. They are reminders that life continues to exist even when we are not actively reaching for it. Alan Watts often spoke about the natural rhythm of expansion and contraction that exists in all living things. The heart contracts and expands. The breath contracts and expands. The tides contract and expand. The emotional life follows the same pattern. Pain is a contraction. Healing is an expansion. The stillness after pain is the space between the two. Turning toward life is what happens when the expansion begins again. It does not mean that the contraction was wrong or unnecessary. It means that the contraction has completed its purpose. As the heart begins to expand again, it is not accompanied by the urgency to reclaim what was lost. It is not driven by the need to replace, repair, or rebuild quickly. The expansion is exploratory rather than motivated. It is a gentle stepping forward, a quiet opening to possibility rather than a search for fulfillment. The person does not try to recreate their previous identity or emotional landscape. They are simply allowing themselves to feel what is present without turning away. This stage often involves a new relationship with time. Before pain reshaped the self, time may have felt linear, goal-oriented, filled with pressure to move forward, achieve, improve, and maintain momentum. After pain, time becomes less rigid. The person begins to live in smaller increments, not because they are avoiding the future, but because the present moment has become more real. The mind no longer projects as far ahead as it once did. The attention remains closer, more grounded, more local. Life is experienced not as something to progress through, but as something to participate in. There is also a shift in how effort is understood. Before, effort may have been associated with striving, reaching, proving, or establishing control. After pain, effort becomes something simpler. It becomes the willingness to show up, to move gently, to return to the body, to breathe, to take part in small tasks without demanding emotional meaning from them. Doing the dishes, going for a walk, washing clothes, sitting near a window, preparing a meal. These actions are not attempts to change the emotional state. They are ways of re-entering the rhythm of life. It is during these ordinary activities that the person often begins to feel something that resembles peace, though it may be faint and easily overlooked. The peace does not arrive with celebration or clarity. It arrives in the steadiness of being able to exist without needing anything to be different from how it is. There may still be moments of sadness, moments of hesitation, moments of fatigue. But the sadness no longer consumes the entire field of experience. It becomes one part of a larger landscape. The emotional world gains dimension again. Turning toward life again also changes how the person relates to others. Relationships no longer serve as sources of identity or rescue. They become places of exchange rather than dependency. The person does not approach others with the expectation that connection will eliminate loneliness. They approach others with the understanding that loneliness is part of being human, and connection is a way of being together in that condition rather than escaping it. This creates relationships that are quieter, steadier, more sincere. The person no longer seeks to impress or perform. They simply show up as they are. This does not mean that the person is suddenly fearless. The fear of being hurt again remains, but it becomes something that can be held rather than something that controls decisions. The heart remains cautious, but the caution is soft rather than rigid. It is awareness rather than defense. It is the recognition that vulnerability is the condition of being alive, not a flaw to eliminate. Eventually, the person begins to notice that they are no longer living in reaction to the past. They are no longer bracing for pain or anticipating loss. They are present, not in a performative or intentional way, but naturally, because the inner world has become quiet enough to allow presence to arise without effort. Life begins to move through them again. Turning toward life does not mean returning to who we were before. It means moving into who we are now. Not restored, not reconstructed, not recovered, but reformed. Softer in some places, stronger in others, and more aware of the depth that exists beneath every moment of experience. This turning is not dramatic. It is subtle. It is gradual. It is real. Chapter 12. The soft power of acceptance. There is a stage in inner growth when a person begins to realize that the effort to control life has caused more suffering than the experiences themselves. This realization does not come quickly, nor does it arrive as a single moment of clarity. It forms slowly, through repeated moments of tension, resistance, and exhaustion, where the mind tries to hold life still and the body tries to keep the heart from feeling what it feels. At some point, a person becomes aware that the resistance is heavier than the feeling itself. And in that recognition, the possibility of acceptance begins to appear, not as resignation, but as a different way of relating to experience. Acceptance is often misunderstood. Many people hear the word and think it means giving up, surrendering to defeat, or agreeing to situations that cause harm. In truth, acceptance is none of these. Acceptance is simply the willingness to acknowledge reality as it is, without adding the extra layers of judgment, interpretation, or narrative that the mind creates. It is the recognition that fighting what already exists does not change it, and that suffering is increased not by the experience itself, but by the attempt to force it to be different. Alan Watts often explained acceptance through the metaphor of water. Water does not resist the shape of the riverbed. It does not try to choose its direction. It moves according to the path that is already present, not because it is weak, but because it understands movement more deeply than force. When a person tries to control life, they become rigid. They try to push against the current. Their energy becomes tight and strained. But when a person begins to accept what is happening, they move with the current rather than against it. Their energy becomes steady rather than tense. Their presence becomes grounded rather than anxious. The experience does not necessarily become easier, but the struggle around it dissolves. Acceptance is not a moment of emotional relief. It is a posture toward life. It is something that develops gradually when a person has exhausted all the strategies that once helped them avoid discomfort. When someone has tried to explain, deny, distract, justify, or escape their emotional reality, and has discovered that none of these strategies bring peace, then acceptance begins to feel like the only remaining option. Not because the person decides to accept, but because there is nowhere else to go. The heart begins to soften, because holding it closed has become too heavy. What makes acceptance powerful is that it does not require the situation to change in order for the internal state to shift. The external world may remain complex. The relationships may still require care. The feelings may continue to move in waves. But acceptance allows the person to meet each moment as it arrives, without bracing against it. The bracing is what creates suffering, the tightening in the mind, the contraction in the chest, the anticipation of impact. When the bracing ends, the emotional experience can pass through the body rather than becoming stuck within it. There is also a shift in perception that arises with acceptance. The person begins to understand that life cannot be controlled in the way the mind once believed. The mind imagines that if it can think enough, anticipate enough, prepare enough, or behave correctly enough, it can prevent pain or loss. But pain and loss are part of being alive, and control does not remove them. When a person stops trying to prevent what cannot be prevented, they free themselves from the anxiety that accompanies constant vigilance. Acceptance does not eliminate fear. It simply allows the fear to exist without taking over. As acceptance deepens, it begins to reshape the emotional environment. Emotions that once felt overwhelming begin to move more fluidly because they are no longer being resisted. Sadness becomes sadness rather than a personal failure. Anger becomes anger rather than a threat to identity. Loneliness becomes loneliness rather than a sign of inadequacy. The emotions are still felt, but they do not define the self. They are weather patterns in the sky rather than permanent climates. The person begins to understand that emotions rise and fall naturally when they are given space to move. Acceptance also reshapes relationships. When a person stops trying to control how others feel, how they respond, or how they behave, there is more room for genuine connection to develop. The person no longer approaches relationships as negotiations of emotional safety. They do not speak in order to manage perception. They speak because they want to share truth. They listen because they want to understand. They do not try to hold others in place. They do not grasp for reassurance. They allow others to be as they are. And this allowance creates a space where both people can breathe. This does not mean that acceptance leads to passivity. In fact, acceptance allows a person to act more clearly. When they are no longer reacting from fear or attempting to control outcomes, they can choose their actions based on what aligns with their values rather than their anxieties. They can set boundaries without anger, because the boundary arises from clarity rather than defense. They can say no without guilt. They can say yes without fear. They can walk away from situations that are harmful not because they are escaping discomfort, but because they are respecting themselves. Acceptance does not remove responsibility. It refines it. It shifts the focus from controlling external conditions to caring for internal alignment. The person begins to understand that their work is not to shape the world into something predictable, but to meet the world with presence, responsiveness, and sincerity. Life becomes less about steering and more about participating. Over time, acceptance changes the texture of daily experience. The world feels less sharp. The mind feels less crowded. The heart feels less guarded. There is more space to notice beauty, even small beauty. The quiet of early morning becomes meaningful. The movement of clouds becomes calming. The sound of someone's voice carries warmth rather than demand. The ordinary details of life become nourishment rather than background. Acceptance is not something that is achieved. It is something that is practiced continually. There will be days when resistance returns. There will be moments when the old patterns of control reappear. But with time, the person learns how to recognize the signs of resistance as they are forming. The tightening in the breath, the quickening of thought, the attempt to anticipate. And in recognizing the pattern, they can choose to soften again. The soft power of acceptance is not about effort. It is about allowing. Allowing the moment to be what it is. Allowing the heart to feel what it feels. Allowing the self to exist without needing to be defined. It is a quieter strength, a steadier strength, a strength that does not need to declare itself. Chapter 13. The interconnected wound. When we go through pain, especially the kind that touches the deepest layers of the self, we often begin with the belief that what we are experiencing is uniquely ours, something that separates us from others rather than connects us to them, because the intensity of personal suffering has a way of closing the world around us until the inner life feels isolated and private. The mind tells us that no one could understand the shape of the pain we carry, because no one else has lived the exact experiences that led to it. And so we retreat inward, carrying the belief that the wound is something solitary. This retreat is not a mistake, and it is not a flaw in our way of coping. It is a natural response to vulnerability. When the heart hurts, it wants protection, and the easiest form of protection is to believe we are alone, because solitude creates edges that feel safe. Yet as time passes and the pain begins to settle into a deeper part of us rather than overwhelming the surface of our days, something quieter begins to emerge. It does not come with clarity or with language. It arrives as recognition. The moment when someone speaks and something in their voice reflects something familiar. The moment when someone pauses before sharing something and we understand the hesitation without needing explanation. The moment when we look at another person and see a softness in their eyes that feels like something we have felt before. These moments are subtle, and they often occur without being named, but they begin to reveal something important about the nature of suffering. The wound is not only ours, it is part of something shared. Alan Watts often pointed out that the sense of separation we experience, this idea of being an isolated self, enclosed in a private world, is not the deeper truth of human existence. The deeper truth is that the self is interconnected with everything around it. Our emotional lives are not separate threads. They are pieces of a woven fabric that overlaps with other lives, other experiences, other hearts. When we suffer, we feel alone not because our suffering is unique, but because we have not yet recognized that others have felt something similar in their own way. Once this recognition arrives, the wound begins to soften. It is no longer something that isolates. It becomes something that connects. This does not mean that all pain is the same. The circumstances of our lives differ, and the events that shape us carry their own weight and texture. However, the emotional resonance, the way loss tightens the chest, the way longing sits in the breath, the way disappointment changes the tone of our thoughts, these are shared across human experience. Realizing this does not take away the depth of what we feel. It simply allows the heart to breathe within it, because the heart begins to understand that pain is not an exile. It is a reminder of our participation in a larger human story. As this awareness deepens, something begins to shift in how we relate to others. Before, we may have interacted from behind the protective layers of identity, performance, or emotional distance. After recognizing the shared nature of suffering, the gap between the inner self and the outer world becomes less rigid. When someone speaks from their own tenderness, we no longer feel the need to defend ourselves or to hide. Our listening becomes more receptive. Our presence becomes less guarded. We no longer feel as though we must prove our strength or conceal our fragility. We understand that the person in front of us has also known what it means to feel deeply. This recognition invites compassion, but the compassion that arises here is not effortful or manufactured. It is not the compassion that tries to fix or to soothe or to instruct. It is a compassion rooted in understanding. It says, without needing to say it, I know something of what you are carrying, because I have carried my own. This does not erase the differences between people. It simply means the heart has room to hold the fact that we are all shaped by things we did not choose. When we see this clearly, The harshness that once appeared in our interactions begins to fall away. Our judgments soften. The need to evaluate others diminishes. We see not the mask or the behavior, but the life moving underneath. The interconnected wound also changes how we relate to our own pain. When we believed the wound was something that separated us, we may have felt shame about its presence. Shame thrives in isolation. It tells us that our pain is a reflection of personal inadequacy, that something is wrong with us for feeling so deeply, that we should be composed when we are not, strong when we are soft, collected when we are trembling. When we realize that suffering is something everyone encounters in some form, the shame dissolves. We no longer see the wound as evidence of failure. We see it as evidence of being alive. In recognizing this, the wound becomes less of a burden and more of a point of contact. It becomes a doorway through which we can meet others more honestly. When we speak about our pain, not dramatically, not to be seen, but simply because it is real, we create space for others to do the same. There is a calmness in this type of sharing. There is no urgency. There is no attempt to convince. It is simply the truth of our inner world expressing itself without fear. And when others share with us, we listen in a different way. We do not listen to solve or interpret. We listen to be with. The wound becomes a place where presence, rather than advice, feels like enough. This does not mean we seek out suffering or define ourselves by it. It means we no longer treat suffering as something that must be hidden, overcome entirely, or resolved before we can be part of the world again. We understand that healing does not require the erasure of pain, but the integration of it. The pain becomes part of the story, not the whole of the story. It becomes part of the emotional depth from which we live. And because of this, we begin to feel less alone, not because someone else has removed the pain, but because the walls that once surrounded the pain have fallen away. The heart is no longer enclosed. It is open, not in a raw or exposed way, but in a grounded, steady way that comes from knowing we are not separate from others in our suffering. This recognition brings a quiet peace. The wound remains, but it no longer isolates. It connects. Chapter 14. The beauty of being human. There is a point in the journey of healing when we begin to see ourselves and others with a depth that was not available before the experiences that opened us. This does not happen all at once, and it does not arrive as a sudden realization. It develops slowly, through many quiet moments of self-observation, through the softening that occurs when we stop fighting the reality of our inner world, and through the gentle recognition that being human has always been a complicated and tender experience. The beauty of being human is not found in perfection, confidence, or clarity. It is found in the openness that develops when we acknowledge the complexity inside us and learn to carry it with steadiness. For much of life, we are taught to strive toward an ideal version of ourselves, a version that appears composed, successful, unbothered, unshaken, and admired. This ideal shapes how we speak, how we act, and how we interpret the world. It creates a standard that often leaves us feeling like we are falling short. When we experience pain, this ideal self can collapse. The identity we constructed to navigate the world may fracture, revealing parts of ourselves that we had hidden or denied. At first, this can feel like loss or failure. Yet over time, we begin to see that the collapse of the ideal self is not destruction. It is a return. When the layers of performance, protection, and self-expectation fall away, what remains is not emptiness. What remains is the actual self, the living, breathing, feeling self that does not need to prove anything. This self is not polished, but it is real. It is not perfectly stable, but it is sincere. It does not always know what to do, but it can sense what is true. There is beauty in this sincerity, not because it is impressive, but because it is honest. Alan Watts often spoke of how our attempts to separate ourselves from the rest of existence create suffering. We imagine that we must stand apart in order to be significant, that our individuality must be defended, that the self must be something sharply defined. Yet when we allow the heart to soften, we begin to see that we are not separate at all. We are part of a continuous movement of life, shaped by experiences we did not choose, influenced by people we have met, and connected to every person who has ever felt uncertainty, hope, longing, or love. The beauty of being human lies in this shared vulnerability. It is not a weakness. It is the thread that weaves us into one another. As the inner world becomes clearer, the way we move through the outer world changes as well. We begin to notice the details of ordinary life, not as background, but as something we are participating in. The sound of someone preparing a meal, the rhythm of footsteps on pavement, the shifting of light across a wall, or the small gestures people make when trying to communicate something meaningful. These moments do not need to be dramatic or profound. They are simply real, and when we are present enough to receive them, they reveal the depth that exists in daily life. The beauty is not in what happens. The beauty is in how we are able to be with what happens. This presence also changes how we relate to others. We no longer require people to perform a role for us. We no longer need them to validate our worth or reflect a particular image of us. Instead, we meet them where they are, with an awareness that they too are carrying their own histories of tenderness, confusion, and transformation. This awareness creates gentleness. It creates patience. It allows relationships to develop at their own pace rather than being driven by fear or desire. We become more willing to listen, not in order to respond, but in order to understand. And understanding becomes a form of connection on its own. Love in this stage becomes less dramatic and more steady. It does not need intensity to feel real. It grows through shared presence rather than emotional urgency. It does not disappear when silence arises. It does not collapse when uncertainty appears. It supports rather than consumes. When love is no longer a search for completion, it becomes a practice of companionship, a way of moving through life alongside another without needing to merge, without needing to control, without needing to be anything other than what we are. This is not a lesser love. It is a quieter love, a love that remains. At the same time, being human means continuing to experience difficulty. Even after healing, there will still be days when sadness or frustration or confusion arises. The difference is that we no longer fear these experiences. We understand that they are temporary. They are part of the movement of life. They do not define us. They do not undo us. We have learned that we can feel deeply without drowning, that we can hurt without being broken, that we can be uncertain without losing our way. This understanding brings steadiness, not certainty, not mastery, just steadiness. There is beauty in knowing that we are not finished. The self continues to unfold, continues to deepen, continues to shift. There is no final version of who we are meant to become. There is only the ongoing experience of being here, in this body, in this life, with these emotions, these memories, these relationships, and this capacity to continue softening. When we stop striving to perfect ourselves, we make room to meet ourselves. And when we meet ourselves, we are able to meet others. The beauty of being human is not something we create. It is something we notice when we stop trying to be someone else. It appears in the moments when we allow ourselves to be present without trying to control the moment. It appears in the way we breathe through discomfort rather than resist it. It appears in the way we care for ourselves and others, not out of obligation, but out of recognition. And because of this, the journey does not end in some elevated state. It settles into something simpler, a life that is lived from the inside rather than performed from the outside. A life that is less about proving and more about experiencing. A life that can hold sorrow and beauty at the same time without needing to resolve one in order to justify the other. A life that is real,